There were 40 men at the outpost when the attack began. By sunrise, only one of them was still able to fight. His name was Sergeant Dillon Jutras. He was bleeding, nearly out of ammunition, and completely surrounded. But as long as he remained standing, the outpost would not fall. This is the story of a lone defender who refused to let the enemy pass, even if it meant facing them entirely on his own. Chapter 1. The Outpost on the Edge of Nowhere. Outpost Vegas. A name that sounded almost humorous to anyone who had never seen it. There were no bright lights, no crowds, and no excitement. Only dust, silence, and a constant feeling that danger could pour down from the mountains at any moment. It was the kind of place where even the wind seemed tired. Perched on a lonely ridge in eastern Afghanistan, Outpost Vegas guarded a narrow valley used by Taliban fighters to move supplies and launch attacks. 40 American soldiers were assigned to hold it, though it often felt as if the entire weight of the war rested on their shoulders alone. Days were blistering, nights were freezing, radio signals broke up without warning, resupply convoys were slow, vulnerable, and often delayed for days. The men lived with uncertainty as their closest companion. Still, they endured because they believed in each other. Among them was Sergeant Dillon Jutras, a soldier whose presence steadied the entire outpost. He did not talk much, yet his silence carried a sense of calm. He was the kind of man who volunteered for the hardest guard shifts, who checked on younger soldiers before checking on himself, and who could be counted on when everything else began to unravel. The others joked that if trouble ever came, Dillon would be the last one standing. None of them imagined how close that prediction would come to the truth. On the morning before the attack, the valley felt different. The mountains were unusually quiet. Even the birds remained hidden. Soldiers moved through their routines with a tension they could not explain. Some sharpened tools they would not normally sharpen. Others cleaned their weapons twice instead of once. Throughout the day, small signs emerged, glints of metal on distant ridges, dust clouds that appeared and disappeared too suddenly, short bursts of radio static that sounded unnatural. Dillon noticed it all. He paused longer than usual at the northern wall, the most exposed section of the outpost. It overlooked a slope that enemy fighters frequently used for reconnaissance. He lifted his binoculars and scanned the ridgeline carefully. Nothing moved. Yet the emptiness made him uneasy. In Afghanistan, silence did not bring peace. Silence was the first warning. By late afternoon, the outpost began to feel disconnected from the world. The sun slipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. The wind picked up, stirring the dust into swirling curtains. It carried a faint whistle, a sound that soldiers recognized all too well. It was the sound the mountains made before something violent began. One of the men shouted across the compound, "I cannot see anything, but something is off." Several heads turned instinctively. Everyone felt it now, that heavy pressure in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks open. Dillon walked the perimeter again. He checked the ammunition boxes, the machine gun positions, the radio batteries. Not because he was ordered to, but because he sensed that this quiet would not last. The outpost felt like a chessboard, moments before the first move. Night approached quickly. The clouds darkened. The valley fell into a kind of stillness that did not feel natural. No laughter, no chatter, no distant animal sounds, only the sound of boots moving slowly across gravel. Outpost Vegas had been probed many times before, but this felt different. This felt final. Dillon took his position at the northern wall just as darkness swallowed the ridgeline. He rested his rifle across the sandbags and listened. Every muscle in his body was alert. The mountains were holding their breath. And somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows, an enemy force was preparing to strike with a ferocity none of them had ever seen. The storm was coming. They could feel it. And for reasons no one could explain, Dillon Jutras felt that it would begin with him. Chapter 2. The night the mountains erupted. The first sign was not a sound. It was a flash. A brief, sharp burst of light at the ridge to the east, so quick that most of the men did not even notice it. But Sergeant Dillon Jutras noticed everything. He straightened, lifted his rifle, and waited. Another flash, then another. He exhaled once, slow and steady. It had begun. The opening shot echoed like a hammer striking steel. Then the mountains roared. Machine guns erupted from 3 different ridge lines at once, their tracers ripping across the night sky like burning comets. Mortars followed, thundering down into the compound with violent blasts that shook the ground and showered the soldiers with dirt and rock. The outpost did not merely come under attack, it was swallowed. Alarms sounded. Men scrambled for cover. Shouts overlapped as leaders tried to regain control. The radio hissed with broken voices. Too many calls for anyone to process at once. For a few terrifying seconds, the world became chaos. Dillon dropped behind the sandbags at the northern wall. Rounds cracked overhead, chewing into the wood and metal inches from his face. The night lit up in bursts of orange and white as enemy fighters poured relentless fire down from elevated positions. The northern slope was the primary target. The enemy knew exactly where to hit. A younger soldier crawled beside Dillon, shaking, shouting something over the gunfire. Dillon grabbed him by the shoulder and pointed to a trench farther back. The soldier nodded, terrified, and sprinted through the dust. Dillon remained. He fired controlled bursts into the darkness, aiming not at silhouettes, but at the muzzle flashes that flared and vanished across the mountainside. Every shot pushed back the enemy by a fraction. Every second he stayed upright meant the outpost could reorganize. Behind him, another mortar struck the compound. The ground jumped. A wall collapsed. Someone screamed. But Dillon did not move. He had the most exposed position in the entire outpost. He knew it. The enemy knew it. And yet he held that position with a steadiness that seemed impossible. An explosion tore into the sandbags in front of him and sent shrapnel across his arms. Blood ran down his sleeve, dark and warm. He wiped it with the back of his glove and kept firing. To his right, a machine gun nest fell silent. He heard the distinct metallic click of a jam. The gunner cursed, working desperately to clear it. Without hesitation, Dillon shifted, leaned into the exposed angle, and fired at the fighters closing in on that position. The enemy adjusted quickly. Rounds stitched across the sandbags, throwing dust into his eyes. He blinked through it, shoulders tight, jaw locked. Training teaches soldiers to take cover. Instinct tells them to survive. But something inside Dillon told him to do the opposite, to stay exactly where he was, to take the brunt of the assault so the men behind him could regroup. A mortar landed so close that the shock wave punched the breath from his lungs. He collapsed to one knee, ears ringing, the world spinning. For a moment he tasted metal in his mouth. He forced himself upright again. He had no idea how many fighters were out there. Dozens, maybe more. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If the northern wall broke, the outpost would fall. And so he fought. Alone on the exposed edge of the compound, cut off by gunfire, surrounded by shadows and muzzle flashes, he fought with a calm that did not make sense even to himself. Another soldier finally crawled up beside him, trying to assist. Dillon gestured firmly for him to stay low, then took his position again. The outpost was bleeding. The enemy was advancing, and the mountains had become a storm of fire. But still, Dillon Jutras did not yield. Not yet. The worst was still coming. Chapter 3. Holding the line alone. The attack had been raging for nearly 15 minutes, yet it already felt like hours. Smoke drifted through the compound in heavy clouds, mixing with dust until every breath tasted like metal. Radio calls blended into a chaotic blur. Leaders were shouting to reorganize, to pull the wounded back, to establish a new firing line. But in the confusion, one part of the outpost was silently falling apart. The northern wall, the most exposed section, the section that enemy fighters always targeted first, and the section that, for a critical moment, had only one defender, Sergeant Dillon Jutras. He reloaded behind a shredded row of sandbags, his hands trembling from adrenaline and pain. His right arm was bleeding heavily now. His helmet, dented by shrapnel, rang with a dull metallic vibration every time he shifted. The blasts, the gunfire, the pressure waves, the stress, all of it pressed down on him like a physical weight. Yet he stayed upright. The northern slope was alive with muzzle flashes. Enemy fighters were moving with confidence, believing they had broken the outer defense. They pushed downward in coordinated waves, spreading out to flank the wall. Dillon understood the danger immediately. If they reached the wire, the outpost would be breached. If the outpost was breached, the men inside would be trapped. He did not allow himself to imagine the consequences beyond that. He rose from behind cover and fired again, short, controlled bursts. His rounds cut through the dark, forcing the attackers to drop and scatter. For a brief moment, everything slowed. He could see the battlefield clearly. He could see the slope, the advancing figures, the flashing rifles, the dust clouds kicked up by incoming rounds. Then the fight surged again. A machine gun on Dillon's left roared to life but fell silent seconds later as a mortar blast hit near its position. Shouts echoed through the dust. 2 soldiers were down. Another tried to drag one of them back, only to be pinned by incoming fire. Dillon shifted his stance. He leaned out farther than anyone should, exposing half his body to gain a better angle. He fired at the fighters, trying to finish off the downed gunner. The pressure on his chest grew tighter. His breath came in sharp pulls, but he kept shooting. A burst of enemy fire ripped across the sandbags in front of him and struck his leg. The impact dropped him instantly. He bit down hard, tasting blood as pain shot through his body. He pushed himself back up. There was no time to think, no time to assess the wound. He had a job to do. He dragged himself into a kneeling position and continued the fight from one knee. Every round he fired mattered. Every second he stayed alive bought the men behind him a chance to reorganize. Behind him, a squad leader finally reached the radio and called for reinforcements. The answer came back through static. Closest unit is 30 minutes out. Hold the line. 30 minutes. An eternity in a battle like this. Dillon checked his ammunition. He had less than 2 magazines left. He exhaled slowly. A mortar landed behind him, the blast lifting him off the ground and slamming him into the sandbags. His ears rang violently, his vision blurred, his hands twitched from the shock. When he blinked the haze away, he realized something chilling. He could not hear the men behind him anymore. Either they had fallen back or they had fallen. The northern wall was his alone. Dillon gripped his rifle, planted his knee firmly into the dirt, and aimed again. The enemy was closing in, 20 fighters, maybe more. They were confident now, shouting as they descended the slope, believing the outpost was collapsing. But as long as one soldier remained at that wall, the enemy would pay dearly for every step they took. Sergeant Dillon Jutras steadied his weapon, wiped the blood from his eyes, and fired into the darkness once more. He would hold the line, no matter the cost. Chapter 4. The Counterattack That Never Came. The outpost felt as if it had been cut open. The northern wall was barely holding, the radio net was shattering under overlapping calls, and the enemy was advancing with the confidence of a force that believed victory was already in its hands. Inside the compound, squad leaders prepared for a counterattack, shouting orders, gathering teams, and checking ammunition. But the attack that should have surged outward never came. The men were either wounded, pinned by fire, or racing to pull their brothers away from collapsing positions. The responsibility for holding the most critical section of the outpost fell to one man, Sergeant Dillon Jutras. He scanned the slope through blood-blurred eyes, searching for the next threat. He could hear the enemy shouting to one another, their voices drifting through the smoke. They were confident. They believed the Americans were broken. Dillon forced himself to stand, bracing against the sandbags. His legs screamed in pain, and his shoulder throbbed where the earlier round had torn through muscle. But quitting was not an option, not while the men behind him were still alive. Another wave of enemy fighters pushed forward, sprinting from cover to cover. Dillon shifted his aim, firing precise shots that slowed their advance. Even wounded, he fought with a cold, mechanical focus. Every bullet counted. A soldier named Reyes crawled up from behind, breathless and pale. "Sarge, we need you to fall back. We have to regroup." Dillon shook his head. "If I move, they will break through." Reyes hesitated, torn between duty and fear. He knew Dillon was right. If the northern wall fell, the enemy would pour into the compound like water through a broken dam. Reluctantly, Reyes dropped back into the smoke, shouting for the others to hold what ground they could. Another mortar exploded nearby, sending a wave of debris across Dillon's position. For a moment he could not see anything but swirling dust. He coughed, lowered his head, then forced himself upright again. Through the haze he spotted something that made his stomach twist. The enemy was not retreating, they were reorganizing. A squad of fighters moved to the far right, attempting to flank the wall. They were close, dangerously close. If they got around the corner, the outpost would be overrun. Dillon understood what he had to do. He climbed onto a more exposed firing position, dragging himself over sandbags that were already falling apart. He had no cover, no protection, only height, only angle. He lifted his weapon and unleashed a burst that cut down the advancing fighters. The rest scattered, shocked by the ferocity of a man who should have been unconscious by now. But climbing higher came at a cost. The enemy saw him clearly now. They focused their fire on the lone silhouette standing against the broken wall. Rounds snapped past him, kicked up dirt around his feet and struck the sandbags behind him. One round tore into the side of his gear, knocking him backward, but he slammed his fist into the sandbags and pulled himself back into position. His determination burned brighter than the muzzle flashes. Behind Dillon, the outpost was struggling to reorganize. Medics carried wounded men across open ground, dragging them behind what little cover remained. Riflemen fired from gaps in the walls, trying desperately to support the northern position. But every few seconds, another soldier went down. Another position fell silent. The counterattack they had planned was slipping away one casualty at a time. And still, Dillon fought. He ejected an empty magazine and reached for another, only to find the pouch nearly empty. He checked his pockets. He had 8 rounds left. 8 rounds to hold a mountain. He breathed deeply, exhaled slowly, and steadied his weapon again. If he could slow the advance long enough, if he could buy just a few more minutes, reinforcements might arrive. But those minutes would have to be paid for in blood. The enemy surged again, shouting, pushing forward with renewed fury. Dillon braced himself. He would fight them with bullets until his bullets were gone. Then he would fight them with whatever he had left. He would not retreat. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 5. Last Stand of a Soldier. The battle had reached the point where time no longer made sense. Minutes stretched into something heavier, something that felt like a lifetime. The smoke was so thick it clung to the skin. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum. Every breath tasted like dust and iron. Sergeant Dillon Jutras stood at the northern wall, swaying slightly, kept upright by sheer force of will. His uniform was torn. His body was bleeding in more places than he could count. Yet his eyes remained sharp, fixed on the slope where the enemy gathered for one final push. He had 8 rounds left. 8. He checked again, as if hoping a miracle had slipped into his vest. Nothing. Behind him, the outpost was in a state of controlled desperation. Soldiers were dragging the wounded to safer ground, shouting for medics, searching frantically for more ammunition. The radio repeated the same message over and over. Reinforcements are on the way. Hold your position. But help was still farther than Dillon had minutes left. The enemy fighters realized the American fire had weakened. Their shots became more confident, closer, sharper. Muzzle flashes bloomed across the mountainside like sparks from a forge. Dillon pressed himself into the sandbags, raised his weapon, and fired. 1 round. 2, 3. Each shot hit its mark, slowing the advance by precious seconds. A bullet struck the wall beside him, spraying his face with dust. Another pierced his collar and burned a line across his shoulder. Pain followed each. Impact, but he forced himself to ignore it. 7, 6, 5. He lowered his rifle for a moment, steadying his breath. A shadow emerged on the slope. A fighter sprinted forward, hurling a grenade toward the broken section of the wall. Dillon reacted instantly. He rose, exposed himself fully, and shot the fighter before he could take cover. The grenade landed short, bounced, and rolled harmlessly down the slope. 4. He felt his strength slipping. Every movement was slower, every breath heavier. A drip of blood traced down his forehead and into his eye, turning the world red for a moment. He wiped it away with the back of his glove. He could hear footsteps behind him. Reyes again. Dillon, you need to fall back. You are hurt. Dillon kept his eyes forward. If I fall back, they break through. Reyes shook his head in disbelief. You cannot hold the line by yourself. Dillon blinked once, slowly. I am not holding it for myself." Reyes hesitated, then disappeared back into the smoke to help the wounded. 3. Another wave of fighters advanced, firing rapidly, trying to overwhelm the last defender. Rounds tore into the sandbags, sending fabric and dust into the air. Dillon shifted, grimacing as pain shot through his leg. 2. He heard a distant roar. Not enemy fire, a helicopter. Maybe more than one. Reinforcements. But they were still too far. The enemy pushed again. They were less than 50 meters from the wire. Dillon gritted his teeth and lifted his rifle once more. 1. The final round fired. The recoil pushed through his injured arm. A fighter fell. The rifle clicked empty. Dillon exhaled slowly. He dropped the empty magazine and let the rifle hang at his side. The enemy hesitated for a moment, confused that the defender had stopped firing. Then they surged forward. Dillon reached for his secondary weapon. His hands shook violently now. Blood ran freely down his sleeve. He lifted the pistol, aimed, fired. 1 shot, 2, 3. He did not count the rest. The enemy staggered, slowed, then scattered as distant American helicopters thundered into the valley. Dillon remained standing for a moment, his silhouette outlined by dust and fire. Then his strength left him all at once. He fell to his knees. The pistol slipped from his hand. His eyes lifted toward the sky as if he wanted to make sure the reinforcements were real. Soldiers rushed to him, shouting his name, grabbing his vest, trying to stop the bleeding. But Sergeant Dillon Jutras had already given everything. He had held the line. He had bought the time. He had saved the outpost. And now, at last, he allowed himself to rest. Chapter 6. The lone defender of Outpost Vegas. Dawn came slowly to the mountains. The sky shifted from black to a deep bruised purple, then finally to a faint orange that touched the ridgelines like a trembling hand. For the first time in hours, the guns fell silent. No more muzzle flashes, no more mortars. Only the hard breathing of exhausted soldiers and the distant thump of American helicopters sweeping the valley. The attack was over. Smoke curled up from the earth, drifting in slow spirals toward the light. The outpost looked like it had been torn apart by claws, walls broken, barriers shredded, equipment scattered. The ground scarred by explosions and soaked with blood. Medics rushed from position to position, calling out for survivors, checking for wounds, lifting debris with shaking hands. Some soldiers sobbed silently as they found friends who no longer moved. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had endured. And at the northern wall, where the attack had been the fiercest, a group of soldiers gathered around a single figure, lying in the dust. Sergeant Dillon Jutras. His uniform was drenched with blood, his gear hung in pieces. His helmet was cracked. Yet his face held a strange calm, as though he knew he had done everything a man could do, and perhaps more. A medic placed 2 fingers on his neck, searching for a pulse. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the medic shouted, "He is alive. I need help now." Soldiers scrambled, lifting Dillon carefully onto a stretcher. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused, drifting between consciousness and darkness. Reyes leaned close, gripping his hand. "You did it, Dillon. You held them off. Reinforcements are here." Dillon did not speak. His lips moved slightly, forming words only Reyes could hear. A whisper carried on a dying breath. Protect the others. It was all he cared about. They carried him toward the helicopter, weaving between rubble and bodies. The rotors kicked up dust, turning the rising sun into a hazy, glowing halo around the aircraft. The medics worked desperately, but they could see the truth written across Dillon's injuries. He had lost too much blood, suffered too much trauma. He had stayed in the fight far longer than any human body should have allowed. The helicopter lifted off, carrying him away from the ridge he had defended with his life. His brothers watched it rise until it vanished into the mountains. Inside the aircraft, a medic squeezed Dillon's hand one last time. His breathing slowed. His chest rose and fell in unsteady tremors. He looked peaceful, as if he knew that Outpost Vegas still stood because of him. Minutes later, the medic lowered his head. Sergeant Dillon Jutras was gone. The news spread through the outpost slowly, settling over the soldiers like a new kind of silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence that comes before a storm, but the silence of respect. The men gathered at the northern wall, the place Dillon had refused to abandon. The ground was scorched, the sandbags torn open, shell casings mixed with blood and dust. It was a battlefield, but it was also a monument. Their voices were low, almost reverent. He saved us. He held them alone. There was no one else who could have done it. In the days that followed, engineers rebuilt Outpost Vegas, raising new walls to replace the torn ones. But the soldiers who lived through that night said the outpost would forever belong to the man who had defended it when everyone else was pinned down or wounded. The lone defender. The man who fought until he had nothing left to give. The man who made sure dozens of others survived to see another sunrise. Sergeant Dillon Jutras. His story did not end on that ridge. It began there, carried forward by every soldier whose life he saved, and by every voice that would one day tell the world what he had done. Epilogue. The mountains around Outpost Vegas healed slowly. The smoke lifted. The echoes faded. The broken walls were rebuilt and reinforced. New soldiers arrived, walking the same narrow paths and taking the same guard posts where others had once stood. But one place never felt the same again, the northern wall. Men who had survived the battle would pause there during quiet hours, standing where Dillon Jutras had stood, looking out toward the slope he held alone. They imagined the roar of the fight, the flashes in the dark, the impossible weight carried by a single man when everyone else needed time to breathe, to regroup, to survive. Commanders wrote reports, medics filled out casualty logs, engineers restored the defenses, but the soldiers who lived through that night told the real story. They spoke of a man who did not retreat, even when wounded. A man who climbed into danger when others begged him to fall back. A man who fought until the rifle in his hands ran dry and then kept fighting anyway. A man who stood between the outpost and destruction and refused to let the enemy pass. In a war filled with chaos, confusion, and loss, his final act remained clear and unmoving, a single soldier holding the line so that dozens of others could live. Outpost Vegas did not fall that night because of him. His brothers carried his memory with them long after they left those mountains. And long after the world forgot the name of that lonely ridge, the men who survived because of him remembered one truth. Heroes do not always leave home for themselves. Sometimes they leave so that someone else can return. Sergeant Dillon Jutras never came home, but because of what he did, many others did. Stay healthy, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and we will see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.